Today I'm going to show you the family tree of the Merovingian dynasty, which was a Frankish dynasty that ruled much of what is today France and Germany between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of Charlemagne. We'll be tracing the line from Clovis I, the first king to unite the Franks, all the way down to the final Merovingian king, Childeric III. We'll also be looking at Charlemagne's ancestry and exploring the question, how far back can we go? Finally, one cannot talk about the Merovingians without addressing the theory put forward in the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail. So we'll be looking at their supposed descent from Jesus and Mary Magdalene as well. This video is part of a multi-channel collaboration called Project Clovis, which includes several other videos about the Merovingians, which you can find by following the link in the description or at the end of the video. We're going to start with the Frankish leader named Merovech, since he was the individual that the Merovingian dynasty is named after. He is actually more of a legendary figure, and not much is known about him. It is thought that he perhaps allied with the Romans against Attila the Hun, and that he might have been the son of another Frankish leader named Clodio, who in turn might have been the son of a legendary king named Pharamond. But all of this is just speculation. The actual history of the dynasty begins with Merovech's son, Childeric I. At that time, the Franks were divided into several subgroups, with the Salian Franks being just one of those groups. So in 476, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, Childeric was king of this group, and they would have been located just south of the Rhine River. For more information on Childeric, you can check out the video in the Project Clovis playlist by the channel Quill and Ink History. Under Childeric's son Clovis, the Frankish territory greatly expanded. In fact, Clovis famously ended up uniting all of the Frankish tribes and becoming their sole king. He also converted to Christianity, in part due to the influence of his second wife, Clotilda, who was a princess from the Kingdom of Burgundy. By this point, several so-called barbarian groups had started to carve up the remains of the former Western Roman Empire, including the Franks, the Burgundians, and the Ostrogoths, who by the time of Clovis controlled Rome itself. Note that Clovis's sister was married to the most famous Ostrogoth leader of all, Theodoric the Great. Now, the Franks actually remained united only for a few years. After the death of Clovis, his kingdom was actually divided between his 4 surviving sons. The original part of his territory, known as Austrasia, went to his eldest son, Theuderic, and the other parts, centered at Orléans, Paris, and Soissons, went to his other sons, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar. But as you can see, all 3 kingdoms were eventually subsumed into Clothar's territory, and hence he became the next person to become king of all the Franks. This was not always a peaceful process. For example, when Clodomir died, he left 3 young sons, but their uncles, Childebert and Clothar, gave them an ultimatum. Choose scissors and cut their long hair, which was a sign of their royalty, after which they could join a monastery, or choose the sword, which they would be killed with. 2 of the boys ended up dying by the sword, and a third became a monk known as Saint Cloud. But even though everything ended up consolidating under Clothar I, yet again, the Franks only remained united for a few years. After the death of Clothar I, the kingdom was again divided into 4 parts. But interestingly, this was followed by yet another slow process of consolidation over the next few decades. So basically, keep in mind that early Francia under the Merovingians was rarely a single united kingdom. It went back and forth between division and consolidation. This time, things first went from 4 branches to 2. Orléans was eventually subsumed into Austrasia, and Paris was subsumed into Soissons, forming Neustria. For the rest of the Merovingian period, Austrasia and Neustria would go back and forth between being separate kingdoms and being united. Once again, remember, Austrasia represented the original Frankish territory, just south of the Rhine River, whereas Neustria basically corresponded with northern France. So let's look at the conflict between Austrasia and Neustria in more detail. First of all, let me point out Saint Bertha, daughter of Cheribert I. She married the King of Kent, one of the main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms over in England. She influenced her husband into becoming the first English king to convert to Christianity, and thus she played a major role in the Christianization of England. But this period in Merovingian history was really dominated by these 2 women here. Brunhilda, who married Sigebert, and Fredegund, who married Chilperic. Brunhilda was the daughter of a Visigothic king, and her sister was the first wife of Chilperic. But eventually one of Chilperic's mistresses, named Fredegund, convinced Chilperic to murder Brunhilda's sister and make her the queen instead, which he did. This, of course, enraged Brunhilda, and thus the feud between these 2 women began. Eventually, Fredegund also had Brunhilda's husband, Sigebert, assassinated, resulting in Brunhilda being the de facto ruler of Austrasia for the next few decades as regent for her son, her grandson, and even a great-grandson. Oddly enough, Chilperic also ended up being assassinated, and obviously Brunhilda was blamed. In fact, the Neustria side blamed Brunhilda for the deaths of 10 Merovingian kings or princes. Who was really to blame, we will probably never know. But what we do know is that Fredegund eventually died of natural causes, but Brunhilda was eventually captured by Fredegund's son Clothar II and brutally killed by being pulled apart by horses. At that point, all of Francia was once again united under a single ruler. Brunhilda is thought to be the inspiration for the character Brunhild, who shows up in Norse mythology and today is best remembered as the Fat Lady, from the phrase, "It ain't over till the fat lady sings." Anyway, if you're interested in learning more about Brunhilda and Fredegund, you'll want to check out the video by History's Who, Yesterday's Nation. Okay, Clothar II was followed by his son Dagobert I, but it's around this time that the Merovingian kings became more like figureheads rather than real rulers. This is because the actual power shifted to a person known as the mayor of the palace, who was sort of like a prime minister. One of the early mayors to wield power was Pepin the Elder, the great-great-great-grandfather of Charlemagne. After Dagobert, the kingdom was once again divided between Austrasia and Neustria. In Austrasia, Pepin's son Grimoald the Elder was now mayor of the palace, and he managed to have his son Childebert declared the adopted son and heir of Sigebert III, having Sigebert III's biological son Dagobert exiled to Ireland. But eventually, Clothar III, who was now king of Neustria, had the usurper killed and took control of Austrasia for himself, becoming king of all the Franks. Now, this is where things get a little complicated, but hopefully these yellow lines will help you follow the succession. So Austrasia eventually wanted its own king. So Clothar III gave it to his younger brother, Childeric II. He then left Neustria to another brother, Theuderic II. But as soon as Clothar III died, Childeric grabbed Neustria for himself, thus becoming king of all the Franks. Then, when Childeric died, Austrasia brought back Dagobert from exile as Dagobert II and made him their king. And Neustria went to Theuderic II as per the original plan. But then Dagobert II was assassinated and Austrasia went to Theuderic, who became king of all the Franks. And from here on, Francia pretty much remains united. Except keep in mind that it's really the mayors of the palace who are really in charge. By this time, that person is Pepin the Middle, a grandson of Pepin the Elder through his daughter Saint Bega. Another individual who lived during this period was Saint Hubertus, one of the more popular medieval saints, being the patron saint of both hunters and metalworkers. In the Project Clovis playlist, you'll find a video about him by the channel History and Headlines. So following Theuderic III, we get several of his descendants reigning as king, as well as the son of Childeric II. But more and more power was shifting to this family over here. In fact, Pepin the Middle, also known as Pepin of Herstal, was given the title Duke of the Franks. When Pepin died, his grandson Theudold became mayor of the palace, but eventually power consolidated around his uncle Charles Martel instead. At this point, the Muslim armies of the Umayyad dynasty attacked Gaul, and Charles Martel managed to keep them at bay. This was an extremely important result because it kept Islam limited to the Iberian Peninsula. Had Charles Martel lost to the Umayyads, the subsequent history of Europe would have been extremely different. To learn more about that invasion, check out the video by Hikmah History. When Theuderic IV died, there was no Merovingian available to take the throne, so Charles Martel ended up becoming acting king. But when Charles died, his two sons, who became co-mayors, found a Merovingian heir, who was either the son of Theuderic IV or perhaps Chilperic II. That person was Childeric III, and he ended up being the last of the Merovingian kings. What happened was that Carloman decided to become a monk, leaving Pepin the Short as the sole mayor of the palace. Note that the Short really should be translated the Younger, contrasting with Pepin the Middle and Pepin the Elder. At this point, the Pope decided that the person with the real power should be king, not the person with the fancy lineage. And thus, a new dynasty took control with Pepin the Short, becoming the first Carolingian king. The word Carolingian meaning of Charles. The final video on the Project Clovis playlist is by the French history channel This is Barris, and it goes into greater detail on this transfer of power from the Merovingians to the Carolingians. Spoiler alert, Pepin's son Charlemagne ends up becoming greater than all of the previous kings we've talked about, and he ends up being crowned emperor in the year 800. If you're looking for a video that traces the line of French kings from Charlemagne all the way down to the final French monarch Napoleon III, I've got a video on that topic, which I'll also link to in the description. But before we go, I want to cover two more quick things. The first is something called descent from antiquity. If you follow this channel regularly, you'll know that every royal house in Europe can somehow trace itself back to Charlemagne. And because of this, it's likely that every single person of European descent alive today is also a descendant of him as well. If you're not sure why that is, you'll want to check out my video, Is Everyone a Descendant of Royalty? But for those of you who have been fortunate enough to actually trace your line back to Charlemagne, the question often comes up, how much farther can we go beyond him? Is it possible to trace a line that goes all the way back to Roman times or even further? This is what the term descent from antiquity refers to, and it's a subject that is debated by genealogy hobbyists. I've seen a lot of people who claim that they can trace their ancestor all the way back to some Egyptian pharaoh, or even to Adam and Eve. Let me tell you straight up. This is a fun thing to speculate about, but the fact is that there is no genealogical records in Europe that can be accurately traced back through the medieval period to ancient times. None. There are theories, yes, but the records simply are too unreliable. After all, that's why they call it the Dark Ages. The earliest known ancestor of Charlemagne that we can confidently say was in fact his ancestor is a saint named Arnulf of Metz, who lived around the same time as Clothar II. If you can trace a line in your own tree to Charlemagne, then this too is as far as you can go with any degree of certainty. However, let me show you one theory that has been put forward. It is thought that Arnulf, or perhaps his wife, or perhaps the wife of Pepin the Elder, was a child of an individual named Arnold, who was the bishop of Metz prior to Arnulf. He was the son of Batilda, who was the daughter of Clothar I. If this is true, this would provide a link between the Carolingians and the Merovingians. But again, let me emphasize, this is all just speculation. Arnold's father, Ansbertus, is thought to be the son of a man named Tonantius Feriolus III. Again, this is very uncertain. But if true, this would make him a descendant of Tonantius Feriolus I, who was the prefect of Gaul at the time when the Western Roman Empire fell. So this is thought to be the most likely way that we might be able to trace Charlemagne back to antiquity. From here, we can try to go even further, but it gets really, really murky and speculative. And speaking of speculative, the other thing I wanted to mention is the theory first put forward in the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and then made popular again by the Dan Brown book, The Da Vinci Code. According to that theory, this individual here, Pharamond, who we're not even sure was an ancestor of Merovec, was the last of the Fisher Kings. The Fisher King being a character in the Arthurian legends who was custodian of the Holy Grail. But according to the theory, the Holy Grail was not actually a cup. It was a secret bloodline, a bloodline that can be traced back to Jesus, and thus back to King David as well. The story goes like this. Jesus, who traditionally is thought to have been celibate, was actually married to the New Testament character known as Mary Magdalene. In one version, Jesus fakes his death, and then they sneak off to southern France and have a son named Joseph, whose line can then be traced to Pharamond. In another version, after the crucifixion, the biblical character Joseph of Arimathea smuggles the child and/or the Holy Grail to England, and a descendant of Joseph of Arimathea becomes King Arthur. What do I think of all this? Well, I think it makes for an interesting story, but there's very likely no truth to it. My opinion is that history tends to be interesting enough without trying to bend it to fit these kind of theories. So, if you found the history of the Merovingian dynasty interesting, you'll definitely want to check out the other videos in the Project Clovis playlist. You can do that now by following the link on screen. Thanks for watching.